All right, thank you everyone for coming. I'm Kristen Z, and as you know, Me Too, time's up, enough is enough. They've been in the news in the recent months. However, the issue of sexual harassment dates back a lot longer. And all along, ABC7 News has been there as an ally. So today, we've gathered you, our panel of experts, with great insight to share with everybody so that we can provide Bay Area resources and Bay Area support for people who may find themselves in that situation. You can see the issue spans across government, business, all sorts of areas, schools. Who amongst you, can I see a show of hands, has experienced or witnessed sexual harassment in your own workplace? Okay, almost everybody. Could I ask a couple of you to share your stories?
I have so many stories to share, but one in particular, which is a gray area. Sometimes we just think that we have to speak up if it's rape, right? But there's a gray area. And for me, I remember being super young, eager in politics, and I remember there were women that would say, hey, be careful going to this event or these fundraisers. Make sure you go with women. Don't go alone. And I remember, okay, well, that's fine. Nothing's going to happen to me. I go to a dinner, and I'm sitting at the table. It's a fundraiser for a candidate. And this man starts talking to me, and I'm eager, I'm in politics, I'm talking about all the things I want to change. And he starts touching my leg under the table. And, you know, I'm like startled. Sometimes I can't hold my facial expression, so I was very shocked. And, you know, he continued to say, it's fine, I just want to get to know you, you're so beautiful, I can help you in politics. Of course, I left the table, I left the event. You know, I have other stories in the office, in a conference room, talking to a male colleague about a project. And he leans over, I'm thinking he's gonna look at my notes and we're just gonna talk about the project. And he continues to, starts to caress my face and says how beautiful I am and that he thinks I'm so smart, he loves my ideas, he wants me to, maybe we can leave our job and start our own business together. And he says that he doesn't have a serious relationship with his wife, he has an open marriage. You know, I was just talking about my project. So I mean, those are just a couple. I have, sadly, tons more to share.
All right. Jonathan?
I also have my own Me Too stories as well, and I just want to say before I talk about them that this is one of the reasons why I think it's really important for men to be part of the conversation too, because men, some men I think have experienced this and can be sympathetic to the issues that a lot of women have experienced. In my case, it's the same kind of stuff. I've had a male colleague in a place of work where I was at my desk and he got up behind my chair and sort of started rubbing up against my head. And it's one of those things where you don't think this can't possibly be happening, and you're kind of confused by it, and you sort of do the polite thing, and you don't actually even say anything at that point, right? So I understand that impulse to just not say anything directly. I've had another instance where someone picked up an object on my desk. Again, it was in a place of work, and he started to do something really crude and sexual with it, not because he was trying to be a bro and trying to be funny, but he was actually trying to gauge my response and receptivity to that kind of sexual act, and that was something that I tried to laugh off at the time, but all of this is to say is that I think that there are men out there who can absolutely understand the difficulty. You sort of don't want to make a big deal of it. You don't want to be sort of a complainer, and so you don't really do anything material with it, and so which is why I was motivated to write some of the things that I did do in my book, Better Together, because I think it's when sexual harassment, the scenario for either men or women, are really, really clearly defined, that you then realize, yeah, that was clearly wrong, or something over here, well, that's actually not a sexual harassment. That's something else, maybe tacky, but not sexual harassment. So I think it's really, really important for these things to be crisply defined and to have men be part of the conversation.
Absolutely. I'm glad you shared your story, Jonathan, because we want to be clear too. It's not a situation where women are always the victims in sexual harassment and men are always the perpetrators of sexual harassment. It can go both ways. In fact, you saw in our reel that we show that there is a California Assemblywoman who's been accused. So I want to get into that. Is it about power? Is it who is in charge?
So I think what's important to understand about all of these personal stories, and I work in journalism and worked in the field and abroad, and also I work at the network level, and I have, all the women there have hundreds and hundreds of stories. But I think what's really important to understand, I've spent a lot of time doing social justice work and working in human trafficking, and the women that I see who are being trafficked are women who are single mothers, who have to work 2 shifts at Wendy's or McDonald's because they don't get their hours in time. So when a manager presses them and sexually harasses them and wants sex from them, it has a huge economic impact on their lives and their children's lives. And so a lot of them, in terms of, we think about it in terms of, I feel very fortunate, like in terms of promotion, or did I get this assignment, or did I get this, get to go on this story. But for the working women who support children, these are very tough economic, they have huge economic impact on these women. And my best way to kind of, for people who don't understand, it's just, so you blew it off and it's really not a big deal, and aren't you flattered that somebody finds you sexually attractive? No, this is not a men versus women issue. This is an issue about an abuse of power. Somebody who has, just like rape and just like sexual assault, somebody who has power over you, and it's an abuse of power. It has nothing to do with sex. So that's my perspective on that.
Yeah, you brought up the shift workers, the single mom, and I want to direct this to Saro and Estella. You both work with women in fields which may be particularly vulnerable because of the situation economically they find themselves in. Can you start with that, Saro?
Sure.
You
So
represent workers, I should say, in the food service industry,
in the restaurant
right?
Industry, right, which is the second largest employer in the United States, largest employer of women, and California has the largest restaurant industry of any state in the United States. We have 1.5 million of the 13 million restaurant workers nationally. So you have to understand, we're not talking about some tiny sector of women. We're talking about the largest employer of women with the absolute lowest wages of any sector in the United States and the highest rates, literally, of sexual harassment. We are the largest source, the restaurant industry is the largest source of complaints to the EEOC. 40% of all sexual harassment charges to the EEOC, and that's a huge gross underreporting because most people don't report, come from one industry, the restaurant industry. And all of our research over the last, and organizing over the last 20 years, has shown that you can trace a lot of this back to a structural issue in our industry, which is that our industry allows employers to basically have part of the compensation be tips. And tipping creates a situation in which women, tipped workers and servers are in vast majority women. So the servers at Denny's and IHOP and Applebee's are the majority of tipped workers in California and America. They have to tolerate all kinds of inappropriate behavior from customers in order to feed their families and tips. And beyond that, our research shows managers actually encourage them, dress more sexy, show more cleavage, wear tighter clothing in order to make more money in tips. So you have to understand, in our industry, which is the largest employer of women, women who are the poorest women in California are told not to tolerate harassment, but to encourage it, to elicit it. And because this is the first job for most young women in America, 1 in 2 American women starts their work life in this industry. This sets the stage for what's acceptable, tolerable, legal in the workplace, so that we have so many women, a lot of the actresses I was at the Golden Globe with or work with in Time's Up, senators that we talk to, legislators say, I've been sexually harassed more recently in my career, but I didn't do anything about it because it was never as bad as it was when I was a young woman working in restaurants, which means our industry is not only the largest and the highest rates of sexual harassment, but because of this structural issue of forcing very poor women to rely on tips, we also set the standard. We set the floor for women across the economy.
That's an interesting point, too, that they start out in those jobs as teenagers,
1
so
in
they're
2
conditioned
Americans.
from a very young age
That's right.
to accept that as the reality
Most
of
of
the
us
workplace.
start working in restaurants in high school, college, or graduate school. This is how we learn. Not only should we tolerate it, but in fact, if we can get it, it's better for us.
We make more money.
That's right.
That is something to think about. How about in the farm industry? I know you represent a lot of farm workers who economically also have a difficult situation, but there may be other concerns for them too.
Yeah, so there's a lot of other concerns in the agricultural community as well. So the thing to keep in mind about farm workers, which includes dairy workers, farm workers, field workers, packing house workers, nursery workers, the thing to keep in mind about them is that they often live in rural communities. Talk about Fresno, Bakersfield, Stockton, all up and down the 99 basically. And the thing about these communities is that they're very close-knit. Everybody knows everybody. And so by speaking up against sexual harassment, sexual assault, you are endangering not just yourself in terms of losing your job, but also your family, people from your community, because they may be blacklisted as well, not just you. The other thing too to keep in mind is, for agricultural workers, a lot of them are non-English speaking, a lot of them are undocumented. So imagine, how difficult it is for a woman in a law firm or in a boardroom, right, to speak up against sexual harassment. Just imagine not even being able to speak the language, being undocumented, having that fear, right, of being deported or even being just reported to the police. And then finally, the other thing too to keep in mind about agricultural work is these workplaces are isolated. We're talking, if any of you have ever been on the 99, I mean, you can see right from the roadway, this is where people are working. This is where agricultural workers are working. And so, you might be the only woman, you might be the only person out in a field on any given day. And that physical isolation contributes as well to the power dynamics that we've been speaking about.
Definitely, yeah, go ahead, Maureen.
Just to change the subject a tiny bit into corporate America, you alluded to lawyers and women in the corporate world speaking up, and I'd just like to bring up that in my experience, I started in the 1980s in the professional services world, back when I was almost always the only woman in the room. For several years, and there's blatant sexual harassment, which I know we're all discussing right now, but there's very subtle sexual harassment that happens in the corporate world and everywhere else as well, that it might not be a touch or an advance, but it's what I experienced often was being in the meeting, and nobody paid any attention to what I was saying. Sometimes I wasn't invited to the meetings that I should have been to. And sometimes I was just passed over. And it's very subtle, but it's very powerful when you're on the corporate ladder and you're working your way up. And how do you deal with that? Because it isn't blatant, So I feel women are still very challenged by that in the corporate world. And Laura, you could probably speak to that. At IBM as well, but there's all forms of sexual harassment, blatant and very subtle.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I do want to transition into defining sexual harassment. I didn't forget what you brought up earlier, which is it is confusing. What is an annoying thing and what is an inappropriate thing and what is an illegal thing in action? So if that's kind of what you wanted to get started with, I'll pass the forward.
Kristen, I appreciate the question.
Yeah.
So credit needs to go to where it's due, which is that Cheryl Ye, who actually who was harassed by startup investor, tech investor Dave McClure, was the one who came up with a very specific 4 levels, 4 definitions, 4 severity levels for sexual harassment, because the belief is that, now, and I've experienced this as a CEO, as a company person in corporate America, oftentimes in the HR, in the employee handbook, it's really kind of broadly defined. It's something that makes you feel uncomfortable, it makes you feel threatened. So with Cheryl's permission, I'm going to talk about her 4 levels, and they're actually in the book that I've written. So level 1 is inappropriate language, and this is comments or remarks that makes the person feel not just uncomfortable, but degraded and actually even threatened or unsafe. And so this could include obscene jokes, crass humor, and again, as I alluded to earlier, and I can give a counterexample where sometimes you can have some crass humor, but it's not necessarily sexual or threatening in nature, and we need to be very thoughtful about that because there's sometimes we err on the margins as well. Now, level 2 is a direct sexual proposition. That's saying to someone, hey, why don't you come up to my hotel room and we'll figure this out, or just, hey, I think that we should have dinner together and go out on a date, right? And so that's something, obviously, if it's non-consensual, if it's unwanted, and the person feels pressure where there's a power differential, that's a problem. The third level of sexual harassment The third, and by the way, I'll pause there for a second because it's really the first two that lives in that ambiguous space that we discussed earlier, where you're like, was that sexual harassment? It didn't feel right. It doesn't seem right, but maybe I don't say anything. And so Cheryl and I have this position, which is that if you can define these things super crisply, where it's not as ambiguous as just merely an uncomfortable remark, you're going to be more able and willing to speak up, and a company's going to be able to do more about it. So the third level is actual sexual bribery or coercion. That's the case where you actually say to the person, hey, if we don't sleep together, you may lose your job, or I may not fund your company. And so there's definitely that taking advantage of that power dynamic. Mm-hmm. And the fourth and final level is sexual imposition, where there's actually, you're physically imposed upon as the victim, you're touched, you're kissed in an unwanted way. It's actual sexual assault. We can all agree that sort of 3 and 4 are clearly bad. 1 and 2 is this gray area that I've seen over and over again. Unfortunately, a couple of times at one of my companies, and I hear over and over again from female colleagues in industry where they choose not to do something simply because it's kind of ill-defined.
So just, Jonathan, to piggyback on what you said, so as I said in the beginning, I work for the IBM Corporation. We have a zero tolerance for any of this. And when you describe the 4 levels, one thing that we do at IBM is we have mandatory training for all our leaders and executives. You have to do this training, and you have to pass this training. And when you talk about this first level of innuendos or making a comment, part of this training includes understanding when you as a leader hear this, you're expected to step in and stop it. And it's not tolerated. We have open door policies where employees can take forward if they feel like something inappropriate has happened. But we're also rolling this training out to all employees now, all 380,000 of them worldwide. We think it's, it's obviously an important subject to the IBM Corporation, but I think people understanding these, what they may believe not important or just a comment, is very much important, right, and stops the further progression of any conversation in those areas.
It's not just important, it's illegal. I mean, I really have to clarify as an attorney who represents low-wage workers that you can talk about 4 levels, but all of it constitutes what's called a hostile work environment, which is completely illegal. And any kind of comments that, for example, in a restaurant, kitchen staff or coworkers or managers make you feel uncomfortable, whether you want to call it tacky or not, do constitute a hostile work environment. And we encourage workers all the time to speak up, and we win suits all the time on those issues. It's really important for viewers to know, regardless of what situation you're in, whether you're in a restaurant or work in a corporation, any kind of comments that make you feel uncomfortable, scared, afraid, especially if it's a power dynamic, are illegal and do constitute a hostile work environment. They're not unimportant or just tacky.
Mm-hmm. And piggybacking on what Saro said, and I've been working with the Times Up people as well, sometimes a lot of men and women say to me, oh, come on, flirting is fun. You're going to take the fun out of working. And a lot of people have met their spouses and they date people that they work with. That's all well and fine, but let's draw a line and understand that what Harvey Weinstein did is, and law enforcement encouraged me, said, you have to say this when you go on this town hall. That's sexual assault. What he did was sexual assault, which is a felony. And why it's important is because, like restaurant workers, people who are in corporate cultures, even at the networks and in entertainment and in movies, it's a very, as Maureen said, it's a subtle thing. Which is, I'll give you a good example, which is a young woman who is no longer young, but who I worked with, and this is a great example because it's a microcosm of what happens, I think, in entertainment, in corporations and whatnot. She got an internship in the Washington Bureau. And there was the guy who was in charge of a very powerful show in front of other men and women producers, male and female producers, said, hey, so-and-so, I just got a new grand piano delivered to my home. Do you want to come and see it? So this kind of, and this didn't happen in the Dark Ages. This is relatively, in contemporaneous times, and here she is. She wants, the best assignment is to be on that show, right? And at the end of this internship, that guy is going to decide whether or not she gets to stay with the network. So her colleagues were saying, just go to his house. go look at the piano. When everybody there already knows that there was a sexual undertone, so let's say that she had gone there and she was raped, people are going to say, or she was assaulted, that she willingly went there. But to a person who doesn't have power like that and who is trying to advance her career, and she's done all the right things, she's equally as educated as the male interns, this becomes a huge obstacle if she does what is right for her in terms of safety. And that's why this issue, for those who poo-poo it or try to say, oh, we're trying to take fun out of the workplace, that's why it's important. And that's why there is that's why there are only 27 female CEOs leading America's Fortune 500. Mm-hmm. It is 2018, so that's why the Me Too movement matters.
I want to address a good point you brought up, though, which is, maybe she does feel some of that pressure to go. And Nashime and also Haley, you both work in industries in which there are a lot of men. Is there ever the sense that, gosh, if I don't show a sense of humor or that I'm laid back, chillaxed, and can mix, there could be a detrimental impact to my career? So you kind of take that ambiguous first step thinking I'm still kind of okay with that and maybe it won't progress to a level 2 or 3 or 4. Is there ever that pressure, you think?
Well, I think in the arts in general, I mean, I think most of the women that we've been hearing most of this information about the Me Too are these actresses who've come out who are artists. And artists encounter this kind of thing all the time. I was just thinking about being in college and having a professor come up behind me and ask me, did I want to come to his studio? And I thought, I don't even have you as a teacher, so why would I go? And then I found out later on that another friend of mine had also been approached by this same guy. Now, it just so happened that he was probably one of the most famous artists on our campus at the time. And fast forward 20 some odd years, he said it to the wrong person. Somebody finally said something. Neither one of us, we talked about it to each other. We felt uncomfortable. We knew it was inappropriate, but we were students. And so it's that whole power dynamic again. And I want to piggyback on what Maureen said, because the whole idea of women versus men and the idea of being somewhere where you are just invisible, to me, in a way, that's a type of harassment. The notion of omission and denial. In the art world, women are undervalued all the way around. I mean, I think that in museums and galleries and all of those dynamics, all those power dynamics that you have to encounter, you do find these kinds of roadblocks put in front of you. And I think that it's very important for us to speak up and to have the courage to really understand when we feel uncomfortable, that it's important for you to let the person know that you feel uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
When organizations employ more women, sexual harassment is less prevalent, research shows. So one way founders, CEOs who care about this issue can directly affect it is by hiring more women and promoting them to leadership positions. Sexual harassment is twice as common in male-dominated organizations as it is in female-dominated organizations.
So, it's so important, I think, that we're talking about power, but we can't, because really, sexual harassment, sexual assault is about power, as others have said here. But we also need to recognize that masculinity is about power. The way that we construct masculinity in America is about having power and control, having dominance over others. And that's prized among men. Men are encouraged, boys learn this growing up, that that's what we're supposed to do. So we can't really talk about the subject at all without talking about men and masculinity. Most men are not sexual predators, but the fact is men are responsible for most of the sexual violence in this country. And we need to really understand then, why is that? That men are responsible for nearly all of the sexual violence in this country? Well, it's because of masculinity. And who's responsible for changing that? Certainly not women's responsibility to change masculinity. It's our responsibility as men to hold other men accountable and to change the culture of manhood in America that enables the Harvey Weinsteins of the world to do what they do.
You're right, because I was looking at a stunning EEOC statistic, and 82% of sexual harassment charges filed are by women, made by women against men, and 17% were filed by men. But I do want to ask you then, how do we redefine the culture? And maybe all of you have ideas about that too. If the culture of masculinity right now is equated to being the powerful dominant one and exerting your control over others, how do we begin to change that both on a family level, the way we raise our boys perhaps, and again I generalize a little bit, but the statistics do support that's how we have to frame the conversation for now, and then how do we reshape that on a corporate cultural level? So let's, if you have thoughts, who wants to begin?
Well, I have a young 16-year-old boy, and so I'm around these 16-year-olds all the time. And I think that for myself personally, one of my jobs, one of my duties is to teach them how to treat women and how to talk to women and how to be a gentleman and how to be sensitive to how you act around women. A friend of mine told me once years ago, she said, you know, women need to stop complaining about how men treat them when they stop raising sons that do that. Now, I'm not saying that it's all on the mothers, because I think the fathers have to have something to say there too. But I also have a young African-American boy who is, it's doubly important for me to teach him how to be cautious in how he interacts in the world, because he's going to get, one of his friends said to me once, he said, you know, sometimes I feel like I have a target on my back. It broke my heart. But these are sensitive, beautiful kids. At some point they change, and I think it's important for us to take a look at that and take care of them while they're still young enough and impressionable enough to be raised and nurtured so that they can be healthy human beings.
I really love this question. You know, there's a great Gloria Steinem quote, which is that it's all fine and good that we're raising our daughters right, but let's also bring up our sons to be good men. And so in my book, I do talk about various ways that you can do that. The first is that men have to, husbands, fathers have to model the right behavior for children. I have an 8-year-old. I'm hoping that by the time he's 18, so 10 years from now, that this issue, which I believe, by the way, is our #1 sort of unresolved social issue of our time, gender disparity, the economic impact of that, sexual discrimination, sexual harassment, I think it's the #1 biggest issue of our time right now. It affects half of the planet, right? I'm hoping that in 10 years, when my 8-year-old is 18 and entering college, that this will be a moot conversation, right? That's first of all my vision and hope. Now, how do you do that? I think #1, men have to pick up the second shift. You have to model the behavior that women are not burdening, going to a day job and then handling the preponderance of the work, the domestic work at home. The second thing is that we have to start to encourage that male and female leadership attributes, which is, I love the point that you made, Dr. Courtenay, that things that are traditionally defined as a strong leader or a great leader, traditionally that's been mapped to traditional conventional male attributes of, you know, assertive, aggressive, you know, go get 'em, right? And then female attributes tend to be stereotypically described as nurturing, collaborative, communicative. And we have to start modeling the behavior that both of those, or a blend of both of those, in either a male or female leader, in either a male parent or a female parent, is 100% acceptable. 100% acceptable. And then I think the third thing that we do to raise the next generation of boys to be better men is to actually allow them to explore, to not narrowly define at a young age. And there's a lot of great research which talks about how if you give a boy a truck, but you give a girl a Barbie doll, that already starts to socialize them to think like, well, occupationally, I guess I'm going to grow up and be a truck driver, or I'm going to be a mechanic, whereas a girl thinks I'm going to be a nurse or a caretaker, right? So I think that we need to do away. We can't be, if your boy wants to wear pink, if your boy wants to play with the Chloe Kim Barbie doll, go for it. You know, let him. And if your girl wants to play with the space shuttle and a truck, that should be cool too. And I think that if we can start to really push on that stuff, we have a shot at the next generation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Estelle?
Well, the thing that really strikes me as we're having this conversation is that sexual harassment, has no boundaries. It affects people of all genders, people of all ethnicities, people of all social classes. And so I just wanted to kind of frame the discussion a little bit. The way that I see it is, sex discrimination is kind of one issue, right? And then you level down to sexual harassment, sexual assault. Sex discrimination is also unlawful, right? But sexual harassment and assault is a form of sex discrimination, at least legally. This is an issue that so many people face, and that we really need to, have a multi-layered approach. It's not just going to be, we're going to fix it by making it unlawful. No, it doesn't work that way. It's not that easy. We have to really look at what we do at the home and in the office and in the workplace.
Thank you for that, because I think it's really important to also acknowledge that people with disabilities are disproportionately affected by sexual harassment and taking advantage. And this is a group that nobody's talking about. It's not part of any of the conversations. And that's partly because people with disabilities are not seen as sexual by our society, or they're seen as overly sexual. So it's sort of this weird conversation that happens like, oh, ha, 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 well, they got it a little bit too. Or, so you're supposed to be doubly flattered if you're a woman, if something like this happens to you. And if you're a man that's doing it, it's sort of, oh, you're excused for that. Sort of like, oh, well, boys will be boys, and here's a man too. People with disabilities are twice as likely to be harassed sexually of either gender. And then among people with disabilities, the group that's probably the largest are people with developmental disabilities. They're 7 times more likely to be harassed because they've, in a way, they're the people that have gotten this message: be a good person, do what people expect you to do, be the, you're kind, you're decent, and people want something, and oh, isn't that nice? And they're not given sexual education because people don't think of them as sexual, or it's too, people are too uncomfortable for that. So, one thing that's interesting about people with disabilities is it's the extreme version of every single conversation that we've been having, with all the filters stripped away, so that you have really everything stripped raw of all the artifice and all that. And that's where the fears are, that's where the lack of education is, that's where the sense of not understanding, and in a way not wanting to understand. And I'll say one more thing that I think that's really important that we're dancing around are media images too, because I think with disability, you don't ever have any or very few complex media portrayals of people that are disabled, leading sexual, interesting lives. And, we're starting to get to that conversation in a lot of other areas in society, and we have little hints of it with disability, but we need more of that. And I think disability is kind of the canary in the coal mine that lets you understand a lot more about all these other issues that are going along.
2 points that you make really struck a chord with me, which is number one, the media images, needing the multifaceted portrayals, realistic portrayals of not just the disabled, but really all the protected groups. They don't always get that, right? One-dimensional characters don't help. And then the other thing you mentioned was that there's this desire to please, perhaps because you've been left for too long on the outside looking in. When someone shows you a little bit of interest, you feel this great need to please, right? And say, yeah. And I think a lot of women, if you can equate that to the situation women face in the corporate world, there is that desire to please, isn't there? Maureen, I know you kind of wanted to shed some light on that.
I have to tell a heartening story here. I feel compelled to before we leave the boys will be boys story. I have a now 24-year-old son who happens to have a twin sister. And 2 years ago, I was in the kitchen, and boys were home from college, and there were at least 10, maybe 12 of my son's friends, all boys, in the kitchen. And they were making pizza, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, working away. You become ignored when you're driving or you're, it's just a wonderful fly on the wall, event. And everybody was buzzing around, and suddenly Jack said, "Oh, Connor, don't be such a girl." And there was this pregnant pause in the whole room, and one of my son's friends turned and went, "You mean a girl who's launching a billion-dollar global technology company? That right. Kind of girl?" And everybody turned to me, and I went, "Thanks, Seth." So it's slowly.
Mm-hmm. It is. So, Kristen, you asked about how we change masculinity, and I think I'm an optimist, so I think we see it evolving, and as Maureen's comment sort of points out, boys are thinking about things differently now, and they're starting to think about masculinity differently. We see that around gender and around sexuality now in young men and women. But to Jonathan's point, we really do need to teach start this process by teaching our sons differently. We need to teach them to have broader, softer kinds of ways of thinking about being a boy or being a man. And we need to do that because we know from decades now of research that men and boys who have more traditional ideas about masculinity, more kind of restrictive ideas about how a man or a boy can be, that those men and boys are significantly more likely to sexually harass others or commit sexual violence. We know this. It's so, again, it really speaks to how we have to change masculinity. And to Catherine's point, the media plays a big part in this. Whether it's video games or movie images that boys see, they all reinforce this idea that manhood and boyhood is about having power and dominance and control over others, and this gets reinforced. Too often we just dismiss boys' poor behavior with boys will be boys, as we're saying. But in terms of the workplace, I think that there's some very specific things we need to do around sexual harassment as men, and we need to, number one, stand with women as allies. And really listen. I think shut up and listen is really something important men need to do. Then we need to stand up to other men who are committing sexual harassment or sexual violence or making lewd comments in the workplace. Because when we don't do that, when we don't stand up to these men, it is a form of consent. It's condoning that behavior. We're complicit when we don't speak up. So we need to speak up. And then lastly, we have, as men, need to change the culture of masculinity in this country. And I think we can't do it for ourselves. We really need to do it for our sons and our daughters so that our daughters aren't raped and aren't sexually harassed, and our sons are not losing their jobs or thrown in jail because they're doing things that are illegal.
How do we make a change in the workplace? And I know we've talked about these videos, these trainings, but those videos and trainings have been around for a really long time, and they don't work. And people don't think they're serious. I mean, people will, or look at their manual really quickly, and they don't know their rights, number one. They don't know what sexual harassment is. We need to change what we have currently in place. I guess that's my point, because it's not working. And there are so many women and men that this happens every single day, and we don't feel that our employer has our back, and we don't feel protected. And we feel that when we do speak up, we need all this evidence, right? Because someone's not gonna believe us. Or my female colleagues will probably think that I was being slutty, or I was dressed inappropriately. And something has to give, because what we have is it's just not working. That's one. And then two, Will, you mentioned this before, we need more allies in this fight. It can't just be the woman that's the victim that's speaking up. We need women and men to talk about this. And you don't have to be a victim yourself to talk about this, because this is not a woman's issue. I was hearing the other day, I read something that a man said, well, I'm a father, I have a wife, I have a mother. I don't think you need to have that connected point in order to make change and in order to speak up. This is a human issue, and if someone's hurt, you should care about that other human, and you should speak up. And so I don't have that answer, that silver bullet on how to make change in corporate America or in the workplace in general, but I think us talking about it and the Me Too movement, it's a social reckoning that's happening right now. And this has been an open secret about sexual harassment for centuries. We all know that guy in the workplace that we should stay away from. We all know that guy. But no one's done anything about that, right? Or they slapped him in the hand, but he still did what he had to do, right? He still went out after work and said something inappropriate to an employee. So whatever we have in place has to change because it's just not working.
So at 68, in the workplace for 40 plus years, leaning in for a long time and trying to persuade the guys to be nice and things to change, I've come to two radical conclusions of my theory of how things should shift. Number one is happening right now, and that's public shunning. I feel really strongly that what we're doing with the hashtag #MeToo and Time's Up is really important, I feel like we have to go this way to maybe get back into the middle, but I feel public shunning important. We have to keep it up. We have to shift through that. And here's my second. We're far away from this, but I believe we should take a page from affirmative action and from the LGBT community. And I think we need to start passing some legislative rules for parity in the workplace, and I think we need to step up the game of forcing this to happen. There you have it. I'm getting radical in my old age.
No, it's a really important point. I just want to say that what we're doing and exploring here goes beyond political spectrums. There's some who would say the Me Too or Time's Up movement is tied to a certain political belief, or it's on one side of the spectrum. What we're trying to do is to broaden that and let people see it is a human issue. As you said, boys and men have moms as well, and when women don't do as well in terms of their take-home pay due to these issues and pressures, that affects any family's pocketbooks, right? It affects any family's well-being. So it is not political, it is cross-cultural, and it involves families and well-being. And I know you feel strongly too, as Maureen mentioned, the legislative point, that something needs to be done on that level. For you feel like it's started.
Absolutely. I would say, if you look at any social movement or social changes in our country, let's take race as an example. We have a long way to go on racial equity in the United States, which is why women of color face these issues much more than white women. But if you look at any change we've made at all on race, it has been through a combination, yes, of cultural change and absolutely policy and legal change. You cannot focus entirely on what we're doing in the home and how we're talking to boys and without some actual policy change, and as you're saying, some consequences for bad actions and also structural change, because if we're all saying the root of the problem is power, then let's pass policies that change the power dynamic. In our industry, we have been doing education and training for years, makes absolutely no difference. But when we did research on this lower wage, the incredibly low wages that especially women who rely on tips earn, we found that the states with higher wages for tipped workers, where they get a full wage or higher and they don't have to rely entirely on tips, have half the rate of sexual harassment as states in the United States with lower wages where women have to rely entirely on tips. Why? Because in states where you get a higher wage, a woman doesn't have to rely entirely on the customer to feed her family. She doesn't have to put up with anything and everything from the customer.
That is the reason behind the battle for the $15 minimum wage.
Absolutely.
In the food
Pay
industry.
equity has an absolute direct connection in terms of power that women have in the workplace. So higher wages is one actual silver bullet that we have seen research shows gets rid of this. And thanks to Me Too and Time's Up, Governor Cuomo in New York, we got him to just announce that he would be raising wages in New York State for tipped workers. We have a number of employers across the country who are following suit, working with us to raise wages in their companies. So we are seeing policy change happening as a result. We need more. President Trump has announced that he's going to make tips the property of owners rather than workers in the United States. We need the state of California to affirmatively and very strongly determine absolutely not. The more power you give employers over workers' wages and tips, the more power you take away from a mostly female workforce and encourage sexual harassment. In Canada, they've passed laws that say women can't be asked to wear different uniforms in a restaurant than a man. I mean, that is power, to force a woman to wear a cocktail uniform as a cocktail waitress and a man wears a different uniform. There are very clear policies we can enact that actually not only change the power dynamic, but go a long way to shifting the culture that we keep talking about, in addition to working on media and the home and the boys. But we have to look at the structural and policy solutions as well.
At the top, and piggybacking on that, this isn't rocket science. There are actually countries like Iceland where if a man and a woman did the same job, they get paid the same amount, and if they don't, they can sue because it is actually illegal. And piggybacking on what Haley said, companies that have more women on boards or have more female employees experience less sexual harassment. I don't think that we can legislate away bad behavior. I just don't think we can. But we cannot tolerate it. Oftentimes what happens in corporate cultures is say, oh, this person is a unicorn. He's like an amazing engineer. Or this guy, Harvey Weinstein, he has the magic that it takes to make Oscar-winning movies. And so we will tolerate bad behavior. So in Jonathan's book, there's an entire chapter called Just Say No to a High Performance Trumping Bad Behavior. And on that note, take a look what's happened in California at companies like Salesforce. Salesforce and Intuit, they on their own, before the law was passed in California, went through and they did an audit of salaries of women and men doing the same job. And lo and behold, and I give great credit to CEO Mark Benioff and his team. They were like, holy tamale, we are paying men who are doing the same job as women millions of dollars more, and so they cut the women a check. That is the right thing to do. And I think to solve this problem, look, men are the ones who are in power right now, and men, if you take a look at venture capital money, why is it that Facebook and Instagram, and Jonathan wrote this, and all the great companies out here in the Valley that have created amazing products and value for the country, why is it they're all led by men? Is it that women don't have great ideas? I'm literally quoting Jonathan on that. Or is it that women aren't getting funded? And it's true that women aren't getting funded. And so I think the number one way we can't legislate away bad behavior. Like the people who are going to be jerks are always going to be jerks. And the men who are going to be hostile to women rising up through the ranks of corporate leadership are going to be, they're going to remain to be jerks. But look what Jonathan did. The whole genesis and the origin of this book is because after the election of Trump, I walked into Jonathan's office. He runs he's founded and runs 2 tech companies. There were women of color. There were more women than men in one of the companies. And I was like, Jonathan, how'd you do this? He said, it's easy. You just do these things. And that was why Better Together was written. But so my point to you is if we have leaders at the top who are being intentional about their leadership and they say, you know what, here's a radical idea. I have how many male workers? I'm only going to recruit for women, which is what Convoy is doing in Seattle. They are only recruiting because they have enough men. So they're only going to recruit for women. It's only when we have women 50-50 in terms of representation in every level of organizations that this kind of problem is going to go away.
I realize there are lawsuits, though, against that as well. There are people who would say that's not the way to go. But you have some ideas that you brought forth from IBM.
Yeah, you bring up some good examples of companies that are stepping up. But you take companies like IBM. We instituted equal pay for equal work in 1930. Long before this was even a discussion point at any sort of legislative level. We've brought on people with disability. We brought on the first person with disability in 1914. So I think it's imperative on corporations and their leadership, as you said, to step up. I'm fortunate I work for a company that's led by a female CEO right now, Jenny Rometty. But it didn't start with Jenny. It started long before that. And I think part of the solution to some of this is really talking about how do we give women opportunities to get those places to succeed in those jobs, to give them those positions of power. We put 2 programs in place at IBM. One of them is Leading in Tech, and it's taking women who have exited the workforce for a temporary period of time, raise a family, have children, do whatever it is that they needed to do, to bring them back. It's typically women that have been out of the workforce between 2 and 20 years. We bring them in as interns. We give them a 12-week assignment, and most of them we've hired on at the conclusion of that internship. But it gives them an opportunity to re-enter the workforce. We also have opportunities where we're mentoring women to become senior leaders in the company, giving them an opportunity to really step up, get those opportunities of visibility, of leadership, and then showing what they can do. So to Will's point and to Jonathan's point, I think both of you made these comments earlier, it's also about the men. It's about the men in these companies really taking on the opportunity to give women those opportunities to take those assignments on.
I think I want to throw this out there. Is there any sense that men may be fearful of mentoring women in this current climate? And Haley, I know you have some thoughts on that.
Definitely. I believe we're at a pivotal moment in the wake of the Me Too and Time's Up movements. It's clearer than ever that we need to put an end to sexual harassment in the workplace. However, there is evidence of a backlash that is harmful to women because of these movements. Twice as many male managers now feel uncomfortable alone with the woman, and the number of men who are uncomfortable mentoring women has more than tripled since the media coverage on sexual harassment. So it's really important now more than ever that men mentor women, sponsor women, and men step up and work on creating equality for everyone in the workplace. And inclusion and diversity really need to be a first priority from the day one of starting a company. And we've seen this in the Bay Area with founders like Stuart Butterfield. He started, the founder of Slack. He created that as an explicit priority from the top down, from day one of Slack. And he now has 43% of women and one of the most diverse workplaces in tech in the Bay Area. And people should look to him and people like that who are leading a great example for the community.
Nashami?
I would be remiss, or we would be remiss, talking about the hashtag Me Too movement if we don't talk about Tarana Burke, who actually founded the movement as a result of a sexually violent incident. And she did something about it. She was proactive. And one of the things that she says is that empathy can help survivors of sexual assault. I am driven by the gaps, the things that are missing, the areas where marginalized people exist, and where the least resources are available for them. There's a lot of online information about sexual violence, but there's not a lot of information about how you as an individual can start dealing with the trauma. We keep talking about how millions engage with the movement, but even if just 10% of those people stay committed to the work, we will have created an incredible army. Because the power of hashtag Me Too isn't just naming it. Naming it is just the beginning of the journey. And I think that that's really, really powerful and important because we as women, as artists, as people who are working in this field, really have an opportunity to make a difference. And sometimes talking is great, but it's the action. I talk to artists all the time about, if you want to make a change, make social justice and make art about social justice. Ruffle up the things a bit. Artists are put here to disturb the peace, as James Baldwin said. So I think that we have to disturb the peace a little bit.
Gotta disturb the peace. Catherine?
One of the ways I think, it's not just telling the stories, but it's getting stories out there because I think it's really important for people to have individual stories about minority experiences or, non-standard, non-mainstream experiences. So I was thinking of, I wanted to give a plug for a group called Rooted in Rights, who are soliciting for disability-based Me Too stories because of that conversation not happening. And I think that once you get more of these stories out there, it's not just telling the story, it's the cumulative effect where people realize that then they too can not just tell the story, but act on it and actually try to make change. But I think it's that power in numbers, and it's very important with minority kind of voices as well.
So there's the telling of the stories and speaking up. There's the legislative efforts. There's the changing of the mindset and the culture. And there's the changing of the corporate ways. All of those, I think, are worth exploring right now as we talk about solutions. Jonathan, I didn't want to miss the point, though, that you recommend a specific action for companies. For example, you do not fund companies that don't have women on the board.
So in my other role as an angel investor in tech companies, I made a pledge a couple of years ago that I would only invest in your company if you have at least one female co-founder. Let me tell you why I did that. My pipeline, in terms of people pitching me, is very, very full. I hear great pitches from men, and I hear amazing, great pitches from women. I actually see no sort of creative or intellectual difference between those ideas. Yet, there's a lot of this very disheartening research from Harvard that shows that the same identical pitch from a man versus a woman, same PowerPoint slide and the same investors, the man gets funded 68% more likely, almost 70% more likely, right? And I think that that's completely unfair. So in my own deal pipeline, I was seeing a lot of amazing ideas, amazing product ideas, new app ideas from women who are working hard, women who are also women of color, and they're just not getting funded. 2 guys from Amazon or Microsoft or Google, they go and they can close a 1.2 million seed round in 3 months. 2 women, they may never close that. It may take them over a year, or they may never get to closing 1.2 million. So I wanted to, in my own way, put my money where my mouth was, and cause some change in my own corner of the universe. And I think it's really important. Now, this is not just doing the right thing, but it's also the smart thing in terms of the what I think of as the return on my investment, right? Is that when you have more women present, you actually get better business results, right? So if you have, for example, company A versus company B. Company A has no women on the board of directors. Company B has 3 women on the board of directors. That second company is going to outperform by 46% average in terms of return on investment, right? So that's really great, right? If you have more women, if you have at least 33% women, 1/3 of your C-suite is women, that company is going to be more profitable and outperform long-term than a company that has fewer than 1/3 women.
So
and
it's
so
not
there's
just
many
altruism, it is actually good business.
Right, that's right.
Is it because of the perspective that women bring to the table? Why is that? Why do you suppose that is more successful when you have that diversity in voices and opinions?
Yeah, and so there are many other smart people in the room who've probably understand the problem than I, but anecdotally in the research of my book and talking with many, many leaders, both men and women, I believe it is a function of the fact that women bring to the table a lot of these amazing qualities that unlock value that have so far, to your earlier point, Will, have sort of been glossed over as not the preferred leadership traits, right? As it turns out, having very high EQ perhaps makes you really, really empathetic to your customers and to your employees and creates cultures where your employees are more fulfilled. As it turns out, being really collaborative and being really communicative is part of being an amazing leader that can inspire other people to do really, really great work. And so that's how I think that this impacts the bottom line.
I think just to piggyback on that quickly here, I agree with everything you said. And inclusion and diversity, it's not just women, it's diversity across the board. When you have inclusion in a company, it allows you to bring your whole self to the table and not pretend to be somebody that you're not. So we have found at IBM that having that ability to be open and having that inclusion with all different diverse groups really changes the game.
Go ahead.
I want to let Estella go.
Okay,
She
go ahead.
hasn't spoken very.
Thank you. 2 things.
That's collaboration, ladies.
2 things. One thing that we haven't talked about in terms of things that we need to address is the victim blaming that happens, right? When women and men speak up against sexual harassment, especially sexual assault. That is what happens to all of my clients. All of my clients who report being raped in the fields, they are all blamed for not dressing the right way, for doing things, for saying things wrong, et cetera, et cetera. And we see that as well in all other industries. We see that when young women in colleges, right, report rape. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it too, of course, is whether or not it's taken seriously by law enforcement, whether it's criminally investigated, if it rises to that level. The other thing too is, in terms of a silver bullet, one thing that companies can do, organizations, companies, employers, is take reports of sexual harassment and assault seriously. They need to be investigated. They need to be dealt with. I'm hearing such wonderful things that that so many Bay Area companies are doing, but to take it back to the fields, to take it back to agriculture, we need to go back to the basics, right? Of just, okay, do you have a reporting? Employers have an affirmative duty in California to prevent sexual harassment and assault in the workplace. It is an affirmative duty. You cannot wait until you get a report of sexual harassment or assault to deal with it. So 1, is there a reporting structure? 2, is it the appropriate reporting structure? 3, is that report taken seriously? Do the people that come forward and complain, do they feel like they are taken seriously? Do you address it? Do you fire the person? Do you discipline the person? Don't just keep them around because they're a great employee, even if you get all these reports of sexual harassment and assault. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. So that's one very basic thing I think that we can do to really address the situation.
Yeah, that echoes Grace's point about don't turn a blind eye just because someone is a high performer. And also, I want to turn that to Haley, because you mentioned the importance of companies handling it the right way when they do get reports. And I think you have a poignant example of what happened to a friend who had to suffer because she did bring it to her company, but it was handled entirely in a way that didn't help.
Yeah, I have a close girlfriend who's 24 years old, who started working very early on at a biotech startup in the Bay Area. And she was, the company was acquired, and her company went out to have drinks after work, and she was grabbed, sexually assaulted by her boss, someone she worked closely with, and she told HR about what happened, and they ended up putting her in the same exact small lab with him, and she suffered there for 6 months until she felt like she could find another job. It's so competitive in the Bay Area, and she couldn't go home to her parents. She was here, she was an immigrant here, so she was stuck in the same lab with him. And to make matters worse, he had a wife, and words quickly spread that she had told HR about it, and so people shamed her and made her feel horrible every day that she ruined her his relationship with his wife, and that he had kids, and so she was constantly been made to feel bad, and it's really affected her ever since. And I see a lot of women in the Bay Area who now do not want to go work for a startup where there's no HR. They don't want to go work for a company that's just 10 men. And so if men are trying to have the best chance at business success, they need to hire women from the very start, or else it's very hard to steer a ship once it's already in that direction. Hiring women after you've already hired 15 men is quite difficult.
Even when you do have HR, I want to quote Chelsea Handler, who said this the other day at an Emily's List breakfast. She said, there is a problem. It's not just men, it's also women in the workplace. And the way that we do not, and this, by the way, is the third rail where everyone gets electrocuted when you try to talk about women not supporting other women. Maybe it's generational, maybe it's my generation, maybe the younger women are doing it better, which I think they are, because they were raised a little differently, and they had to, and maybe the numbers were better in the workplace. But women have to also understand, particularly women who are in human resources, and there are sometimes the highest ranking woman in a company is human resources. And women don't have to be best friends with everybody, but you gotta be a sister to other women. And that means when you are in a position of power, not feeling like you have to, so oftentimes what happens research-wise is they say that other women, because they're one of the only women, they feel like they need to distance themselves from the other women or minority in the workplace. That happened to me. I was with another Asian female producer, and we were unicorns ages ago. And I said, now she's, I said, why weren't we friends? And she was like, because if you failed, I didn't want, first of all, nobody could tell us apart anyway, right? And if you failed, I didn't want to be associated with your failure. And I think we're in different times now, and I think it's really super important for women to stand together in this important moment. And that also means that we don't engage. Like, you can't have it both ways. If the men aren't going to be able to tell jokes and so-and-so and, about so-and-so and so-and-so, we can't gossip about other women. The district manager who's coming in to have dinner with the male regional manager, we can't gossip about her, because that's also undercutting women, female managers. And gossiping is fun, right? But it's the little things. It's policing little behaviors. And if you're a man, and there are lots of good men, and they always say to me, well, what can we do? Here's what you can do. There is a police study that says when police officers see police brutality, 50% of them will always back up whatever, whatever is best for the police force. And the other half say that their actions after they've experienced a bad incident is completely predicated on what others in the group are doing. If somebody else calls out the bad behavior and says, look, I am not backing you up on this, this was a bad thing, then they will take that lead. But if somebody remains silent, then they will also remain silent. And I think that's pertinent here. I think if you see something in the workplace as a man or a woman, and it has to do with a gender issue or a diversity or a racial issue, or a gender identity issue, it's up to you to either call it out and say, hey, that wasn't cool, or staying silent is being complicit.
So while yes, I am a woman's woman, I support the women I work with, but so one of my listeners, I reached out to them and I said, please share stories around sexual harassment. I'm going to be doing this panel. I want everyone to, have a voice at the table. And one particular woman crying was sharing how she was assaulted at work. She was very scared, but she mustered the strength to go to her HR person, which was a woman. And a few days later, she was fired. And while, yes, it's great to be a sister and support each other, but this has nothing to do with this. This is your job, right? If you're HR, you should take this seriously. And, this whole likability thing, or, there's women that you like in the office and not, this goes beyond that, right? This is ethical, this is moral. If someone is coming to you because they've been abused or harassed in some way, this is your job, right? Even if your boss is telling you this is wrong, you should have integrity and do the right thing and report it above you.
All right, thanks,
right?
Rena. We'll go to Maureen and Will, and then I'm going to ask a final question of the panel.
So here's what's driving me nuts, about this conversation and about everything in general about women. We are so forgetting we're half the world. We are half the world. There's 50% men and 50% women. Who controls most of the economic clout in the universe? Women. It's something like 77% of all spend in the universe is by women. It's trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. Back when Ray Rice, knocked his wife out in the elevator, my husband had to hold me back because I said, I'm taking a pause for worldwide women. I'm going to devote my whole life to getting this guy fired. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to get a couple 100,000 women to stop buying Budweiser or Pepsi for a week. And you better believe that guy would be gone in a day. We are forgetting our power here. We are forgetting our power. We need to step up here. Me Too is a start, but it needs to go way beyond that. It needs to be giant public shunning and giant economic voting with our, our wallets. And yes, it needs legislation.
Thanks, Will.
What bugs me, Maureen, is hearing Haley talk about these guys who feel uncomfortable being in a room with women now, and it's like, yeah, imagine that. It's like, do you know how these women have felt for decades and decades and decades? It's like, you're a big boy now. You can deal with it. You'll feel a little uncomfortable, yes, and that's not a bad thing. So I think part of the problem here is that men don't really recognize the power. Saru, you really focused on the power and the structural stuff that needs to change here, and I think it's so important. And men, I think, are not aware of the power that they hold. And I think part of what really needs to happen at work and in these trainings that happen is sort of like what's happening now nationally around race, where white folk are suddenly starting to realize, oh, so maybe I do have an advantage over people of color. And these are like subtle, everyday, and oftentimes not so subtle, but everyday kinds of interactions that happen that shape our lives in really enormous ways. And men, I think, are kind of oblivious to the fact that there are ways that they have power over women that they are not even aware of, that they have advantages, everyday sort of advantages when they walk into a room, when they go before, some venture capitalists to say, will you fund this? Men are not aware that they have that advantage, and we need to make them aware of that. Another way I think we need to do that is to think about the language we use. Karina, you had mentioned that sexual harassment is not a women's issue. And it's so important because, when we talk about sexual harassment as a women's issue, men turn off. They stop listening. They think, okay, well, it's a women's issue. Who deals with women's issues? Women deal with them. And we stop really listening. So I think we really need to rethink that. Sexual violence is a huge problem for women, but it's really an issue with men and with masculinity. That's where the issue lies. And I think we need to talk about it differently. When we talk about rape, we talk about, how many women are raped each year. So where are the perpetrators in that? They're invisible. They're sort of in the shadows. So the way we should really talk about it is men's sexual violence. How many men are responsible for the rape of women each year? How many men are responsible for rape or sexual harassment? That's reframing it. And if we don't do that, it's very easy, as you said, to blame the victim, or as you said, Estella, to blame the victim. We start asking the wrong questions. We start asking, what was she wearing? How much did she drink at that holiday party at work? So, I think the way that we structure the conversation, the way that we, the dialogue around it really shapes the way that we think about it.
In my college days, I worked as a volunteer as a sexual assault counselor, in that I was really more of an advocate for people who have been assaulted. And I will say that that feeling of shame, that it was my fault somehow, was very pervasive. And now, well, 20, maybe 10 years later. Who's counting? Things haven't changed that much. That's still, we need to do a lot of work there. I won't say how many years exactly, but I do want to leave you all with one final thought. We've had a great discussion, but I'd like to ask each of you to leave us either with your favorite resource or your point of action plan for men, women, or companies. Sarah, we'll start with you.
Great. So we have a diner's guide, and I've created a book out of it called Forked, a new standard for American dining, that tells you restaurants that are providing higher wages, better benefits, are better on mobility. On the issue of HR, the chains largely do horribly in our guide. They have the lowest wages, the worst benefits. They all have HR departments. But as an example, the Olive Garden, which does very poorly in our guide, has had an HR department and a zero tolerance policy for years, and we call it a zero tolerance policy for complaining about harassment, because the minute you go and complain about harassment, you're fired. So, to the point of why is it better? What makes it better for companies? Why is the bottom line better when women are in leadership and people take proactive steps on sexual harassment? We find that the restaurants that do really well in our guide have half the rate of employee turnover as the restaurants that do really poorly, because women stay longer if they feel like they're treated well and paid well and valued as the professionals that they are. So quick action people can do is go to our guide, ROC National Diners Guide, support restaurants that are doing it right, go to other restaurants and communicate your values to managers and owners.
So I want to give a shout out to the Rooted in Rights / Disability Visibility Project that's collecting Me Too stories. That's one thing. But I think really disability should be incorporated into all the Me Too conversations, all the harassment conversations, and really in trainings and anything, make sure that all your materials are accessible, that the spaces are accessible, and that you've got the voices and the kind of our, the expressions of people with disabilities that are at part of the leadership, part of the organization. That's in terms of protests, it's in terms of information giving and gathering, and don't always assume that people with disabilities are going to know about what's happening everywhere. You really need to broaden the conversation to make sure more people are included. The other thing that I would add is that we've been talking about workplaces, but I think we need a very large, generous definition of the term workplace, because the workplace can be the home when you've got caregivers and people like that, and that's a super important environment that's got all sorts of complicated issues because of blending home and work environments, and people that are caregivers are subjected to harassment. People that are caregivers are harassers. So, all of that we need to be thinking very, very large and not so literally about what a workplace is and who works and who doesn't.
In time for Women's History Month, they published an issue for NEA Arts, and Wilhelmina Halliday, someone asked her, what do you think can be done to better address the challenges of women in the art world face today? And she gave a kind of 5-point answer to that. And one was, when you see exhibitions are unequal or you see performances are unequal, contact the gallery or museum and let them know. So it's not just the artists and the people who are doing the work, it's also the audiences. The audiences need to speak up and say, you don't have enough women showing their work, you don't have enough minorities showing their work. Support women artists and institutions that are exhibiting their work. Be more of an activist. If you think somebody is doing a good job, be sure you tell people. If an art fair has a high number of women in it and the sales are good, art newspapers and magazines should be sure to point that out. And educate yourself. I think that's really, really very important, to educate ourselves about all the work that's going on and see how diversity and equity and access are being applied in these areas. And I think finally, that we have to think about this whole notion of sexual harassment from other points of view. I mentioned I have a son. Men perpetrate sexual harassment against women, but there are some women who also do the same thing. And oftentimes, if they're not reciprocated, if they're not responded to in the way that they want to be responded to, then there's an accusation is placed on the men that may or may not be true. And I have to say that because I think about history. I think about the Scottsboro Boys. I think about Emmett Till. And these are young men who were accused of doing something they didn't do, and they paid for it either with prison or with their lives. And finally, to back up Maureen's point of view about paying attention with our wallets, the Montgomery bus boycott was successful because the women in Montgomery, white and black, refused to ride the bus, and it made a difference.
So I would recommend, a lot of what I was talking about was based on the work of Jackson Katz, who has been doing this work for a long time, and so I would recommend just finding out more about Jackson Katz and Mentors in Violence Prevention. That is the group that he runs, Mentors in Violence Prevention. I'm sure he can come out to your company, he can go into your communities. He's a great speaker and addresses these issues. Again, Jackson Katz, K-A-T-Z.
I think a tremendous resource for both men and women is Sheryl Sandberg's leanin.org. She has a new initiative called Mentor Her, which is has a lot of actionable advice that men in any industry can take in terms of helping women, as well as a lot of advice for women who might not have an HR department where they work, or if something happens. It's a really tremendous resource.
I strongly recommend that everyone come to Worldwide Women, www.worldwidewomen.co. 6,000 listings of quite amazing and powerful organizations and services for women in 23 cities, 13 countries around the world. Information and connection, I believe, are hugely powerful tools to change the game for women, and that's what we're all about. So come on over. It's free.
So the one resource that I would recommend is the National Women's Law Center. They have a lot of free resources for women that are experiencing sexual harassment. So I will, on my website, reachmama.com, link them and some other resources so that women and men have access to this information.
I would direct the public to my organization's website, California Rural Legal Assistance. We have offices in many parts of rural California. We provide legal defense to individuals who face sexual harassment and assault in the workplace, not just in agriculture, but in many rural communities as well. So I would really encourage people to donate to us, as well as the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. They also are accepting donations to fund attorneys to represent individuals who are victims of sexual assault and harassment in the workplace.
I would recommend that that employees and young people, and if you have a sister or a brother who is just entering the workplace, that you buy the book Better Together, 8 Ways Working with Women Creates Extraordinary Products and Profits, because I believe that in that book there are 8 solutions to the 50-50 problem. And if companies take the Better Together pledge, to Maureen's point, you'll know which companies to go work at, and you'll also know what products you want to buy.
You know, a couple of resources that have really inspired me over the years, and I'm not under, board or anything like that, is the Kapoor Center for Research, and they've actually been doing a lot of studies over the years, over a decade, on the very exact issues that we've been talking about, and they're able to also distill down to some intentional and purposeful solutions that all CEOs and managers and people can take notice of and actually implement. So I respect them a lot. There's a lot there. As Haley mentioned, I like leanin.org as well as a resource. They've also done a really great job of distilling down this info. Both of these organizations did inspire me as well when we worked on the book Better Together, to sort of humanize a lot of these solutions, and because I've operationally had put some of these solutions into practice at companies that I've run, I know that they work. And so I will also underscore that if you don't want to dig through all of the research that's at the Kapoor Center or leanin.org, you can buy the book Better Together, Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble, and you'll get a really, really great top leveling of a lot of these issues as they've been applied to industry.
There's not any specific resource I want to cite, but what I would ask every one of us is to be aware of unconscious biases and to call those out. We all try to do the right thing, but we don't recognize it necessarily. And I know for myself, I appreciate it when others come to me and said, what you said really wasn't quite on point, and point it out to me. So I would challenge each one of us to point it out to each other and help us be better people.
Thank you all so much for that. Really appreciate it. If you're facing sexual harassment at work, hopefully you see through our conversation today that you are not alone, that you have a voice. If you are dealing with these issues, our website is a great resource for you, a great place to start. We've compiled and vetted some of the best Bay Area resources and put them all in one place for you to be able to access. And that website is abc7news.com/takeaction. Again, abc7news.com/takeaction. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for being allies in action.